Hello everyone, today we read the preface to the first edition of von Clausewitz' Vom Kriege by Marie von Clausewitz, born Marie von Brühl, von Clausewitz's wife. And we will also introduce a little bit the figure of Marie that has been important because among other things, she was actually a patron of the arts. She was an interesting personality, but she is mostly famous for having, in fact, edited and published the work of her husband, and especially, not just, but especially naturally, the treatise on war, the Vom Kriege. Most of the information I will tell about her is from the book. If you're interested, Etimova Bellinger, Bellinger's Marie von Clausewitz, the woman behind the making of On War. It's published by Oxford University Press, 2016. While for the translation, I will be using the old J.J. Graham one, published in London in 1873, but it's a relatively simple text, so naturally when we will read the Vom Kriege we will use a bit more sophisticated instruments, but that's still a reliable translation. So relatively to the information on Marie that you can also find on Wikipedia, quoted from Bellinger's book. She was born Marie Sophie Gräfin von Brühl, so Countess Marie Sophie von Brühl. She was born on June the 3rd, 1779, and died on January the 28th, 1836. So actually just 5 years after her husband. She was a member of the noble German von Brühl family. That has origins essentially in Saxony and Thuringia. Their ancestral seat was in Ganglofshömern in Thuringia. And there are branches of this family still existing today. There was an indirect, during the 18th century, an indirect control on Saxony and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by Heinrich von Brühl, and it was at the time was one of the most important families within the Holy Roman Empire, and also one of the most influential into Europe today. I don't know how widely known it is, but it's nevertheless interesting. And as we were saying, Marie has been actually very had her own career. She was an independent woman for the times. She was a patron of the arts in Berlin, and she eventually, as we were saying, came to fame mostly because of her publishing of the Vom Kriege. Marie was born in Warsaw to Count Karl Adolf von Brühl and Sophie Gom, who was an aunt of the British Field Marshal William Maynard Gom. He would take part actually at the Battle of Quatre Bras and the Battle of Waterloo as well. So actually her mother, Marie's mother, was very fluent in English, and she taught that to her daughter. The real name of Marie actually was Maria Sophia in German, but she was called Marie by her family. It was this kind of French influenced stylization of the culture at the time in the 18th century. In fact, Marie's father taught her to write and read in French, and how to compose letters in a manner appropriate for a lady of high society. In that time, French was very important, was the leading language at that point in history. And Marie was the oldest child of her parents, um, although many of her siblings had died as infants. So that also kind of typical of the times, I mean, dramatic aspects of those times' lives. And Marie, probably because of this reason, grew particularly protective of her sister Fanny, who had survived a the smallpox epidemic, and eventually, when Fanny died in March 1804 due to the complication during childbirth, Marie was left in trust of the orphaned daughter, so to her nephew, to her niece, sorry. And Brule also, I mean, Marie also treated her younger brother more like a son rather than a brother. Um, as many, as most of the women at the time, she, as noble women, she began her education at home, and particularly under her father's guidance. As we were saying, he taught her French, while she learned she learned English from her mother. And in fact, she was very fluent in these two languages, and she would teach them to the friends, to the children of other friends of hers. Uh, so she together with her sister before her death, she took certain lessons also in painting, music, and history, and there was a lot relative pressure from her mother's side to make of her daughters a sort of a true phenomenon, as it said. So there were lots of expectations put on her. It must have not been easy, though, knowing also what her, how her life eventually was and her problems, as we will see. She was also a talented painter, patron of the arts, and she was also close friends with the novelist Bettina von Arnim. She was a German writer and novelist, and actually quite polymatic person, and she was also very close to Goethe, Beethoven, and Pückler, and also she was admired by figures like Schumann, Liszt, Kinkel, and Brahms. So that was the kind of ferment that existed at the time in this milieu of good society, let's say, the noble society, and these cultural acquaintances were. It was an extraordinary time. In the last video made on the context of von Clausewitz's life and times, I discussed what great minds were living at the time and influencing themselves reciprocally in a certain measure. And this would make objectively Maria a very intelligent and educated person, and that was also very appreciated because of this intellectual skills by her husband. At the age of 18, Marie became actually a lady in waiting for Queen Dowager Frederica Louisa of Hesse-Darmstadt. So she was the queen consort of Prussia as the second spouse of King Frederick William II. So you can understand what the social status of Marie was, what kind of milieu she frequented, and this position was terminated in February 1805 when following the Queen Dowager's death. So Marie eventually became the chief lady in waiting for Princess Charlotte, and who in fact was the eldest surviving daughter of King Frederick William III of Prussia and Queen Louise of Prussia. She would actually become Empress of Russia as the wife of Emperor Nicholas I. And at the time, the princess was just 11 years old. And after the death of her husband von Clausewitz, Mary assumed the role of chief lady in waiting for Princess Augusta in Berlin. Princess Augusta was the Queen of Prussia and the first German empress as the consort of William I, German emperor. Interestingly enough, von Clausewitz had been the instructor of the young William I himself. So you understand what level in society this couple had. In 1813, Marie eventually also volunteered at a military hospital. So Marie met Karl von Clausewitz in December 1803 through two mutual friends of theirs that were Princess Louise and her husband Prince Anthony Radziwiłł, if I pronounce it correctly. So at this point, Marie's father had died from less than 1 year. Died unexpectedly due to the complications from a liver disease in July of 1802, and the courtship between Marie and Karl lasted was pretty lengthy for a couple of reasons. First of all, Marie's mother was disapproved actually the relationship with von Clausewitz because he was a man of lesser social standing than the von Brühl family. So von Clausewitz also had actually no inheritance and was financially relying solely on his lieutenant's pay, which at the time was not enough to support a family, especially of that living conditions. So at the time, actually marrying without the mother's consensus was impossible for Marie. So she was actually herself pretty hesitant to commit to the relationship because she had to consider many other factors, also the circumstances surrounding the courtship, the milieu that she was frequenting, other opportunities. So she was also pretty old for those time standards when she met von Clausewitz. In fact, she began to write with him, to have a regular correspondence, only in her late 20s. Now, in late 20s at the time, especially for a woman, were considered, a very late time. For the marrying age was usually much earlier. So, as a consequence, Marie was one of the few unmarried women during that time who had earned, by the way, an income on her own, interestingly enough. And she regarded this condition as substantially as a freedom that she praised, and she didn't actually want it to lose in many ways. So Marie and Karl were formally engaged, officially engaged, let's say better, in May 1806, and after 4 years, von Clausewitz received an important promotion from Frederick William the third that promoted him to the rank of major, and gave to him the official permission to marry. So finally, on December 17th, 1810, Marie and Karl married. So it seems that the couple was extremely, it was particular at the time. They both frequently discussed about politics, literature, current events together, and they considered each other as equals, which was pretty rare, especially for a man to think regarding his own wife like that at the time. So they had this kind of intellectual balance that for which they were quite interested in all these various intellectual ferments, and Marie actually grew acquainted to her husband theories and knowledge, and that's also part of the reason why we know she actually studied the Vom Kriege. And Karl and Marie were unable to conceive children. We don't really know why. Today it's usually thought that Karl's health was basically chronic illness was basically the culprit, and they were married for a total of 21 years until von Clausewitz's death. So, as we know, von Clausewitz died in 1831 because of cholera, and from 1832 to 1834, Marie edited and published several of her husband's books, including the Vom Kriege. So throughout their correspondence, we know that Marie insisted that Karl sent her his drafts and notes for safekeeping. So she was well acquainted to her husband's work and was searching a way to secure it. And von Clausewitz was known to have an unorganized writing process, like many genial talents, that would often lead to loose papers and unfinished ideas. So in fact, the same Vom Kriege is incomplete, but albeit it really had a huge period of preparation fundamentally. In fact, when von Clausewitz was writing the Vom Kriege, Marie was acting as the researcher and copywriter for the book. So she was deeply involved in the thing, and Marie's handwriting also can be found on some pages of the Vom Kriege manuscript, listing notes and references. So what we will read today is practically what Marie wrote as a preface to the Vom Kriege, and in which she explains essentially the role that she had in the process. In the summer of 1832, so just less than 1 year after von Clausewitz's death, a publishing house in Berlin had to put out announcements and advertising to the upcoming publication of the Vom Kriege. With the help of her brother, Marie also transcribed drafts and inserted changes on the Vom Kriege in a matter of months. Talking about Marie's later years and eventually death, toward the end of her life, Marie was complaining of certain tightness in her chest and ringing in her ears. She actually kept living a very busy life, and also with a rather irregular and hectic schedule that wasn't perhaps very helpful. And especially you can imagine with along what the responsibility that derived from being as chief lady in waiting, but Marie also was putting kind of pressure on herself to publish her deceased husband's works, and people who surrounded her were really concerned about her health and mood swings and frequent restlessness. So you may attribute in part this psychological disturbs to this kind of maybe very demanding mother. We know that Marie suffered of a psychological breakdown after an intense fight with her mother, and the after these episodes, the doctors prescribed various treatments and medications, including practices that were very common at the time, rather ineffective, like such as bloodletting, laxatives, and nauseants. So, as a consequence, in fact, Marie seemed to grow sicker and less lucid, and she even sometimes spoke of herself in third person. And so her cousin Karl von Brühl insisted on moving her to Dresden to salvage what was left of her health. So kind of a desperate situation. And one of the nurses stated basically Marie's arm seemed to have gotten infected due to the practice of bloodletting. Marie might have also contracted hepatitis from the bloodletting instruments, would be rather common. So, due to the lack of knowledge about modern medicine and germs, the doctor in Dresden simply diagnosed Marie with damaged nerves and ceased treatment. So eventually she died at the age of 56 on January the 28th, 1836. We can't pass to the text. So okay, I will just read, then we will comment later if there is something interesting about it. So, preface to the first edition by Marie von Clausewitz. It will naturally excite surprise that a preface by a female hand should accompany a work on such a subject as the present. For my friends, no explanation of the circumstance is required, but I hope, by simple relation of the cause, to clear myself of the appearance of presumption in the eyes also of those to whom I am not known. The work to which these lines serve as a preface occupied almost entirely the last 12 years of the life of my inexpressibly beloved husband, who has unfortunately been torn too soon from myself and his country. To complete it was his most earnest desire, but it was not his intention that it should be published during his life, and if I tried to persuade him to alter that intention, he often answered, half in jest, but also perhaps half in foreboding of early death, "Thou shalt publish it." These words, which in those happy days often drew tears from me, little as I was inclined to attach a serious meaning to them, make it now, in the opinion of my friends, a duty incumbent on me to introduce the posthumous works of my beloved husband, with a few prefatory lines from myself. And although here may be a difference of opinion on this point, still I am sure there will be no mistake as to the feeling which has prompted me to overcome the timidity which makes any such appearance, even in a subordinate part, so difficult for a woman. It will be understood, as a matter of course, that I cannot have the most remote intention of considering myself as the real editress of a work which is far above the scope of my capacity. I only stand at its side as an affectionate companion on its entrance into the world. This position, I may well claim, as a similar one was allowed me during its formation and progress. Those who are acquainted with our happy married life and know how we shared everything with each other, not only joy and sorrow, but also every occupation, every interest of daily life, will understand that my beloved husband could not be occupied on a work of this kind without its being known to me. Therefore, no one can like me bear testimony to the zeal, to the love with which he labored on it, to the hopes which he bound up with it, as well as the manner and time of its elaboration. His richly gifted mind had from his early youth longed for light and truth, and, varied as were his talents, still he had chiefly directed his reflections to the science of war, to which the duties of his profession called him, and which are of such importance for the benefit of states. Scharnhorst was the first to lead him into the right road, and his subsequent appointment in 1810 as instructor at the General War School, as well as the honor conferred on him at the same time of giving military instruction to Her Royal Highness His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, tended further to give his investigation and studies that direction, and to lead him to put down in writing whatever conclusions he arrived at. A paper with which he finished the instruction of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince contains the germ of his subsequent works. But it was in the year 1816 at Koblenz that he first devoted himself again to scientific labors and to collecting the fruits which his rich experience in those 4 eventful years had brought to maturity. He wrote down his views in the first place in short essays, only loosely connected with each other. The following, without date, which has been found amongst his papers, seems to belong to those early days. In the principles here committed to the paper, in my opinion, the chief things which compose strategy, as it is called, are touched upon. I looked upon them only as materials, and had just got to such a length towards the molding them into a wall. These materials have been amassed without any regularly preconceived plan. My view was at first, without regard to system and strict connection, to put down results of my reflections upon the most important points in quite brief, precise, compact propositions. The manner in which Montesquieu had treated his subject floated before me in idea. I thought that concise, sententious chapters, which I proposed at first to call grains, would attract the attention of the intelligent just as much by that which was to be developed from them, as by that which they contained in themselves. I had, therefore, before me in idea intelligent readers already acquainted with the subject. But my nature, which always impels me to development and systematizing, at last worked its way out also in this instance. For some time I was able to confine myself to extracting only the most important results from the essays, which, to attain clearness and conviction in my own mind, I wrote upon different subjects, to concentrating in that manner their spirit in a small compass. But afterwards my peculiarity gained ascendancy completely. I have developed what I could, and thus naturally have supposed a reader not yet acquainted with the subject. The more I advanced with the work, and the more I yielded to the spirit of investigation, so much the more I was also led to system, and thus then chapter after chapter has been inserted. My ultimate view has now been to go through the wall once more, to establish by further explanation much of the earlier treatises, and perhaps to condense in 2 results many analyses on the later ones, and thus to make a moderate wall out of it, forming a small octavo volume. But it was my wish also in this to avoid everything common, everything that it is planned of itself, that has been said 100 times and is generally accepted. For my ambition was to write a book that would not be forgotten in 2 or 3 years, and which anyone interested in the subject would at all events take up more than once. Yeah, this is beautiful. Now Marie starts writing again. In Koblenz, where he was much occupied with duty, he could only give occasional hours to his private studies. It was not until 1818, after his appointment as director of the General Academy of War at Berlin, that he had the leisure to expand his work and enrich it from the history of modern wars. This leisure also reconciled him to his new avocation, which in other respects was not satisfactory to him, as according to the existing organization of the Academy, the scientific part of the course is not under the director, but concluded by a board of studies. Free as he was from all petty vanity, from every feeling of restless, egoistical ambition, still he felt the desire to be really useful, and not to leave inactive the abilities with which God had endowed him. In active life, he was not in a position in which this longing could be satisfied, and he had little hope of attaining to any such position. His whole energies were therefore directed upon the domain of science, and the benefit which he adopted to lay the foundation of by his work was the object of his life. That, notwithstanding this, the resolution not to let the work appear until later his death became more confirmed is the best proof that no vain, paltry longing for praise and distinction, no particle of egoistical views was mixed up with this noble aspiration for great and lasting usefulness. Thus he worked diligently on until, in the spring of 1830, he was appointed to the artillery, and his energies were called into activity in such a different sphere and to such a high degree that he was obliged, for the moment at least, to give up literally all literary work. He then put his papers in order, sealed up the separate packets, labeled them, and took sorrowful leave of this employment which he loved so much. He was sent to Breslau in August of the same year as chief of the 2nd Artillery District, but in December recalled to Berlin, and appointed chief of staff to the Field Marshal Count Gneisenau for the term of his command. In March 1831, he accompanied his revered commander to Posen. When he returned from there to Breslau in November, after the melancholy event which had taken place, he hoped to resume his work and perhaps complete it in the course of the winter. The Almighty has willed it should be otherwise. On the 7th November he returned to Breslau. On the 16th he was no more, and the packets sealed by himself were not opened until after his death. The papers thus left are those now made public in the following volumes, exactly in the condition in which they were found, without a word being added or erased. Still, however, there was much to do before publication in the way of putting them in order and consulting them about them. And I am deeply indebted to several sincere friends for the assistance they have afforded me, particularly Major O. Etzel, who kindly undertook the correction of the press, as well as the preparation of the maps to accompany the historical parts of the work. I must also mention my much-loved brother, who was my support in the hour of my misfortune, and who has also done much for me in respect of these papers. Among other things, by carefully examining and putting them in order, he found the commencement of the revision which my dear husband wrote in the year 1827, and mentions in the notice hereafter next as a work he had in view. This revision has been inserted in the place intended for it in the first book, for it does not go any further, there are still many other friends to whom I might offer my thanks for their advice, for their sympathy and friendship which they have shown me. But if I do not name them all, they will, I'm sure, not have any doubts of my sincere gratitude. It is all the greater from my firm conviction that all they have done was not only on my own account, but for the friend whom God has thus called away from them so soon. If I have been highly blessed as the wife of such a man during one of 20 years, so I am still, notwithstanding my irreparable loss, by the treasure of my recollections and of my hopes, by the rich legacy of sympathy and friendship I owe to beloved departed, by the elevating feeling which I experience at seeing his rare worth so generally and honorably acknowledged. The trust confined to me by a royal couple is a fresh benefit for which I have to thank the Almighty, as it opens to me an honorable occupation to which I devote myself. May this occupation be blessed, and may the dear little prince, who is now entrusted to my care, some day read this book and be animated by it to deeds like those of his glorious ancestors. Written at the Marble Palace, Potsdam, June the 30th, 1832. Marie von Clausewitz, born Countess Brühl, Ober of Meisterin, to Her Royal Highness the Princess William. So, rather moving to read, really. I found a couple of interesting things. First of all, as you understand, she was an extremely well-versed, talented, even writer. She expresses herself beautifully. She's very modest, precise, clear. That's all beautiful qualities. And what I found interesting, aside from naturally the general, the most practical explanations of how she she thanks all the friends and the people who have helped her editing and publishing this work. It's definitely important. We see that there has been the participation also of other figures, especially I think the Major of Etzel, or I don't remember whether it was him or another, actually cured certain parts that were also related to the history of the various Napoleonic military events that von Clausewitz had described. But aside from this, really, what I found interesting first of all is when she talks about how she was fundamentally acquainted with the work and how she was taking care of it in part. And the first thing came to my attention is that von Clausewitz wanted actually his work to be posthumous, and Marie claims that she was first of all very she was the one who was kind of asking for more before we read it before, but I mean the fact that von Clausewitz was a bit disordered. He had all this material that she was trying to put together fundamentally, even when Karl was still alive, and it's very interesting, this labor process of the writing of the Vom Kriege. And it's also pretty sad that what she says, that von Clausewitz wanted to finish, in fact, the Vom Kriege, to give it a definitive asset in the same winter before he died, which would have maybe given us so much more in terms of certain ideas and thoughts. But I believe that really what von Clausewitz wanted to express through his work has been really told. Let me see if there is something more precise I wanted to point out. Well, there are the quotes directly from Clausewitz that she inserts into the introduction that reveal how von Clausewitz had actually started from a series of scattered considerations that he wanted to present as essays on their own. That eventually, the more he was, developing and writing, was kind of eventually putting together and joining them and making of them a whole theory and a larger work. Here it says, the more I advanced with the work and the more I yielded to the spirit of investigation so much, the more I was also led to system. So hence he starts inserting even chapters. Interestingly enough, he says that basically he had started to write these essays originally with the intention of talking to a public who was already well acquainted with these subjects. So he was essentially trusting the mind of intelligent readers who already could understand the topic without too many further considerations. This is interesting because objectively, Vom Kriege is, in the fashion it is written, has this kind of systematical and theoretical structure that starts, in fact, it makes really many examples. It goes into relative detail to certain aspects, but remains always, pretty. I don't know. I can't say detached because it's not the right term, but I mean it's as if he was getting to certain principles fundamentally, and that for which eventually the other considerations departed. So it probably, this structure was emerging from this originally rather abstract ideas that started definitely from very concrete evidence, but were being presented to people who were kind of already acquainted to that evidence, and that now were kind of theorizing over them. So at least this is what I suspect, but I'm not necessarily right about this. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Then he says also that he kind of reversed partly this thing. He says, in fact, this is the point: I had therefore before me in idea intelligent readers already acquainted with the subject, but by nature, which always impels me to develop and systematizing at last working its way out. Also in this instance, for some time I was able to confine myself to extracting only from the most important results from the essays, which, to attain clearness and conviction in my own mind, I wrote upon different subjects to concentrate in that manner their spirit in a small compass. But afterwards my peculiarity gained ascendancy completely. I have developed what I could, and thus naturally have supposed a reader not yet acquainted with the subject. So okay, he's basically saying that he reversed this, as he presents indeed, if you read the Vom Kriege, you have this theoretical structure, but he eventually gets into details, into examples, into elements that are always kind of framed on that theoretical structure, but that are meant to make even the unacquainted reader understand what he's talking about. So this is very important. Really, this is why also in part the Vom Kriege has been so famous among civilians, because that essentially brought to it was really a book meant for everyone. So he had started in origin with this theory that with these considerations that presuppose someone experiences, someone already bursts into technical aspects and had kind of extracted it for that reason, and eventually he loaded it with these other elements. So and developing the system. So here it said another thing that struck me. This is one of the this is a beautiful phrase that he says, but it was my wish also in this to avoid everything common, everything that is plain of itself, that has been said 100 times and is generally accepted. For my ambition was to write a book that would not be forgotten in 2 or 3 years, and which anyone interested in the subject would at all events take up more than once. This is beautiful, because this is really it. Von Clausewitz can use very complicated, very complex, and as well as very simple concepts in his work, but he says something, he's never banal. It is true. When he says something banal, he's always, apparently banal, like a banal example, he's always using it for making you understand something more complex. So he's never using, in fact, everything that is plain of itself, that's been said 100 times, is generally accepted. Also, this is important, and he seems to have been aware that what he was saying was not generally at that point in history, at that point in military theory, also given that he was partly in polemical relation around with Jomini at that time, etc. That that there was something that he would be accepted immediately. Von Clausewitz took some time, objectively, before he was fully understood and spread of this. So at least also outside Prussia and this is the point. And another thing he says, quite importantly, is that as we've read just now, that I don't want to write a book that will be forgotten in a couple of years. I want that a book, and remember, because this is so very important every time you take the Vom Kriege in your hands to read it, I want a book that anyone interested in the subject would at all events take up more than once. And this is it, and this is how objectively the Vom Kriege should be read and studied. I mean, really looking at it, trying to understand it, never giving it for granted, not thinking it's an opinion or something you can just read once and say, okay, well, that's... No, because something that can really turn out, at all events, to be useful practically. That's also a very important character of the Vom Kriege. It's a practical book. It's really giving you certain usable information you can apply in many ways. So, yes, this is pretty much it. There are very moving passages actually in this introduction, but we have read them. I won't comment specifically on them. And oh yeah, initially the fact that he I didn't complete the sentence then, that von Clausewitz wanted Marie to publish the work when he would have died. So this is also interesting, and seemingly it's like how he said it sometimes with the way she says it. When he said he often answered half in jest, but also perhaps half in foreboding of early death, poor von Clausewitz, "Thou shalt publish it," because that was the reason, and because she was trying to persuade him to alter the intention of publishing it after his death. So yeah. Then what else can we spot? I wouldn't say there is, perhaps. I'm sure there's plenty of interesting things to comment. Everything she says actually is very fascinating, but in the essentials. This other thing, he was free from all petty vanity, from every feeling of restless, egoistical ambition. Still he felt a desire to be really useful, and not to leave inactive the abilities with which God had endowed him. So this is very important, because it expresses the will of von Clausewitz of writing something useful, something that could really make a difference. A book would have not been forgotten because it was of utility. Just imagine the context in which this was written. I mean, these people had just gone through the most devastating wars that Europe had ever seen. The problem of the relation between politics and war and society, etc., is deeply felt into the work, because it was felt as a practical, as a useful tool to even theoretically know how to lead a war. After the Prussian disaster of 1806, there have been many questions that have been raised. I mean, this work probably really arises from very deep considerations, very deep concerns about politics and society, saying, what is war? Not to misuse it fundamentally, not to go to disaster. These are people who had suffered this on their skins and had fought it through and had risked their lives. So, and they had seen their nation destroyed fundamentally. So this is very important to understand. Also, very importantly, Marie writes, his whole energies were therefore directed upon the domain of science, and the benefit which he hoped to lay the foundation of by his work was the object of his life. Von Clausewitz wanted to present a scientific work in the truest sense of the word. I mean, really figuring out what war is in the first place and how it works and how can you hopefully win one. And that notwithstanding this, the resolution not to let the work appear until after his death became more confirmed is the best proof that no vain, paltry longing for praise and distinction, no particle of egoistical views, was mixed up with his noble aspiration of great and lasting usefulness. We are still studying von Clausewitz, and nobody's ever beaten him. And nobody ever will. So yes, these were important points. So we hear here that she stresses the fact that the Vom Kriege had substantially been published now was being published with the condition in which the volumes were found in the exact condition in which they were found, without a word being added or erased. Still, however, there was much to do before publication in the way of putting them in order and consulting about them. So here they tried also to figure out how this had to be conceived. Okay, yes, this is substantially it. It was an interesting read, actually. Yeah, so maybe next time we'll pass to a notice. Von Clausewitz, excuse me, I check one thing because I can tell you so next time what we do exactly. So this preface from Marie, then there is a notice here. A notice that von Clausewitz wrote, and that is also interesting. Then there is the premise of the author, and then it starts the first book on the essence of war, and then the chapter, what is war, and we will read the introduction afterwards. So, yeah. So we will actually get relatively tiny bits. These are not so tiny, actually, but certain paragraphs will. So, but they're still very meaningful because von Clausewitz must be understood and relatively understood at little doses, one by one, and always keeping in mind it's a system you have to figure out to understand. It's a theory, it's a very complex theory, and you have to stay sharp, let's say, to understand it. Okay, so for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.